The morning sun cast long shadows across the military training ground as Sarah Martinez adjusted her combat vest for the third time. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the adrenaline that had been building since she received orders to report for advanced combat training. At 22, she was one of the youngest female soldiers to qualify for the Elite Special Operations Preparatory Course, and she knew every eye would be watching her today. Sergeant Rick Thompson stood at the center of the training circle, his massive frame casting an intimidating shadow over the assembled soldiers. His reputation preceded him, a decorated veteran with 15 years of service, known for his brutal training methods and his particular disdain for what he called diversity experiments in the military. His cold blue eyes surveyed the group of 12 soldiers, lingering noticeably on Sarah. "Listen up, maggots," Thompson barked, his voice cutting through the crisp morning air. "Today we're doing close-quarters combat training. This isn't a dance class, and I won't be holding anyone's hand. You either have what it takes, or you wash out. Simple as that." Sarah felt her heart rate increase as she noticed Thompson's gaze returning to her repeatedly. She had heard whispers about his attitude toward female soldiers, but she had hoped the rumors were exaggerated. The way he looked at her now, with barely concealed contempt, told her otherwise. The other soldiers in the group were a mix of seasoned veterans and promising newcomers like herself. Most avoided eye contact with Thompson, but Sarah forced herself to meet his stare. She had worked too hard to get here to be intimidated now. Her father had served in the same unit 20 years ago, and she carried the weight of his legacy on her shoulders. "Martinez," Thompson called out, making her surname sound like a curse. "Since you're so eager, you'll be my first demonstration partner. Let's see what all the fuss is about." The circle of soldiers stepped back, creating a larger space in the center. Sarah walked forward, her boots crunching on the gravel. She could feel the tension in the air. Everyone knew this wasn't going to be a fair demonstration. Thompson had a reputation for using training exercises to humiliate soldiers he didn't think belonged in his unit. "The scenario is simple," Thompson announced to the group, never taking his eyes off Sarah. "Enemy combatant tries to take your weapon. Your job is to neutralize the threat and maintain control. Martinez here is going to show us how a real soldier handles the situation." Sarah nodded, falling into a ready stance. She had trained for months preparing for this moment. Her instructors at basic training had praised her natural ability and quick reflexes. She was fast, smart, and determined. But, as Thompson began to circle her like a predator, she realized this would be different from any training she had experienced before. Without warning, Thompson lunged forward, his hand shooting out toward the weapon on Sarah's hip. The movement was faster and more aggressive than any training scenario she had practiced. She reacted instinctively, pivoting to block his advance while maintaining control of her weapon. For a moment, it looked like she might successfully complete the exercise. But Thompson wasn't done. Instead of following standard training protocol, he escalated the encounter. His movements became more violent, his grip more aggressive. Sarah found herself struggling not just to complete the exercise, but to maintain her balance as Thompson used his significant weight advantage against her. "Is that all you've got, Martinez?" he sneered, his face inches from hers as they grappled. "This is what happens when we lower our standards. You're going to get real soldiers killed out there." The words stung, but Sarah refused to give up. She had faced discrimination before, whispered comments about her gender, doubts about her capabilities, suggestions that she was only there to fill a quota. But she had proven herself at every step, earning her place through merit and determination. The other soldiers watched in uncomfortable silence. Some looked away, clearly disturbed by what they were witnessing. Others seemed torn between intervening and maintaining military protocol. Everyone knew that challenging a sergeant during a training exercise could have serious consequences for their own careers. Sarah managed to break free from Thompson's grip and create some distance between them. She was breathing hard, sweat beading on her forehead despite the cool morning air. But she wasn't backing down. If this was what it took to prove herself, she would endure it. "Impressive," Thompson said with mock appreciation. "But let's see how you handle a real threat. What happened next crossed every line of appropriate training conduct. Thompson's attack became personal, his movements designed not to test Sarah's abilities but to overpower and humiliate her. When she successfully countered one of his moves, landing him on his back, his expression turned dark with rage. The crack of Thompson's hand across Sarah's face echoed across the training ground like a gunshot. The assembled soldiers stood frozen in shock as the red mark bloomed across her cheek. This wasn't training anymore, this was assault, witnessed by a dozen fellow soldiers who were now faced with an impossible situation. Sarah staggered backward, her hand instinctively rising to her burning cheek. The metallic taste of blood filled her mouth where her teeth had cut the inside of her lip. But it wasn't the physical pain that devastated her, it was the humiliation, the casual cruelty, the message that her best efforts would never be enough for men like Thompson. "That's what happens when you think you can play soldier," Thompson said coldly, adjusting his uniform as if nothing had happened. "Maybe now you'll understand that this isn't a game." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah stood there, fighting back tears of rage and humiliation, while Thompson looked around at the other soldiers with a challenge in his eyes. His expression clearly said that anyone who had a problem with what just happened was welcome to speak up. None of them did. Private Johnson, a young soldier from Texas who had always been friendly to Sarah, looked like he wanted to say something but remained frozen. Corporal Williams, who had daughters of his own, stared at the ground with shame written across his face. The entire group seemed paralyzed by the breach of protocol they had just witnessed. "Training's over for today," Thompson announced casually, as if he hadn't just committed a career-ending assault in front of multiple witnesses. "I want everyone to think about what they saw here. Think about whether you have what it takes to be a real soldier, or whether you're just wasting everyone's time." As the group began to disperse, Sarah remained standing in the center of the circle, still processing what had just happened. The rational part of her mind knew she should report the incident immediately. But another part of her, the part that had fought so hard to be taken seriously, whispered that reporting it would only confirm Thompson's prejudices about female soldiers being weak. The other soldiers filed past her, most avoiding eye contact. A few offered sympathetic glances, but no one spoke. The code of silence that governed military culture was already taking hold, and Sarah could feel herself being isolated by an invisible barrier of complicity and fear. As Thompson walked away, he paused and looked back at her one final time. "Martinez," he called out, his voice carrying a warning. "I hope you learned something today about the real world. Because out there, the enemy won't go easy on you just because you're a woman." The words were meant to sound like military wisdom, but everyone present understood their real meaning. This was a threat, a promise that things would only get worse for Sarah if she didn't accept her place or, better yet, quit entirely. Sarah finally lowered her hand from her cheek, feeling the heat radiating from the mark Thompson's hand had left. Her whole body was shaking now, not from fear but from a mixture of rage, humiliation, and determination. She had worked too hard and come too far to let one bigoted sergeant destroy her dreams. But, as she walked back toward the barracks, she couldn't shake the feeling that everything had changed. The other soldiers who had witnessed the assault now saw her as a victim, which was almost worse than being seen as incompetent. Thompson had succeeded in marking her, not just physically but socially, within the tight-knit military community. The weight of the decision before her felt overwhelming. She could report the incident and face the inevitable backlash from Thompson's supporters, or she could try to tough it out and hope things would improve. Neither option seemed likely to lead to the military career she had dreamed of since childhood. As she reached the barracks, Sarah caught sight of her reflection in a window. The red mark on her cheek was already darkening into a bruise, a visible reminder of what had just transpired. But it was her eyes that caught her attention. They held a determination that hadn't been there before, forged in the crucible of injustice and humiliation. What Sarah didn't know was that her ordeal was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The events set in motion by Thompson's assault would soon spiral beyond anything either of them could imagine, involving people and consequences that neither had considered. The military base operated on a complex hierarchy of command and responsibility, with multiple oversight systems designed to prevent exactly the kind of abuse Sarah had just experienced. But these systems only worked when someone was brave enough to activate them, and when the right people were paying attention. Unknown to Sarah or Thompson, their training exercise had not gone entirely unnoticed. Military installations were under constant surveillance, not just from external threats but from internal monitoring systems designed to ensure proper conduct and protocol adherence. Video cameras recorded training exercises for later review, ostensibly for improvement and safety purposes. More importantly, the base had recently been flagged for a comprehensive review by higher command following several complaints about training standards and conduct. A team of colonels from the Pentagon had arrived just days earlier to conduct unannounced inspections and interviews as part of a broader investigation into allegations of misconduct and discrimination within the Special Operations training pipeline. These colonels were not ordinary military bureaucrats. They were seasoned officers with sterling reputations, tasked specifically with cleaning up units that had developed toxic cultures. They had the authority to make immediate changes and the backing of the highest levels of military leadership. As Sarah sat on her bunk, trying to process what had happened and decide on her next move, she had no idea that wheels were already in motion that would bring Thompson's career to a swift and decisive end. The question was whether she would have the courage to play her part when the moment came, or whether fear and military culture would silence her voice forever. The afternoon mess hall buzzed with its usual activity, but Sarah noticed how conversation seemed to quiet as she passed by tables. The bruise on her cheek had darkened considerably, and, despite her attempts to cover it with makeup, it remained visible to anyone who looked closely. She carried her tray to an empty table in the corner, preferring solitude to the awkward glances and whispered conversations that followed her. Private Johnson approached her table hesitantly, his lunch tray balanced in his hands. "Mind if I sit?" he asked quietly, already scanning the room to see who might be watching. Sarah nodded without looking up from her barely touched food. Johnson was one of the few soldiers who had always treated her as an equal, never making her feel like an outsider because of her gender. But even he seemed different now, more cautious and uncomfortable. "Look, Martinez," he began in a low voice, "what happened today, that wasn't right." Thompson crossed a line. "Did he?" Sarah replied bitterly. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looked like business as usual." Nobody seemed particularly surprised. Johnson shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "It's not that simple, and you know it. Thompson's got connections, influence. He's been here longer than any of us, and he's tight with the command structure. If someone goes against him, their career is over," Sarah finished for him. "I get it, Johnson. I really do. The system protects its own, and I'm not part of that club." "That's not what I'm saying," Johnson protested, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced of his own words. "I'm just saying you need to be smart about this. Think about your future here." Sarah finally looked up at him, and Johnson was struck by the determination in her eyes despite the ugly bruise marking her face. "What future? You think after today Thompson's going to suddenly start treating me fairly? You think the other instructors haven't already heard about what happened?" Before Johnson could respond, Corporal Williams approached their table. He was older than most of the other soldiers, a career military man with 2 daughters back home. His face was etched with conflict as he stood beside their table. "Martinez," he said quietly, "I need to talk to you." Sarah looked up at him expectantly, hoping that maybe one person would finally do the right thing. "What Thompson did today," Williams continued, his voice barely above a whisper, "it was wrong. But you need to understand the position this puts all of us in. We're all being evaluated right now, and any kind of incident report could affect our careers, our families." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Even Williams, whom she had respected and who clearly knew what Thompson had done was wrong, was asking her to stay silent to protect his own interests. "So that's it?" Sarah asked, her voice rising slightly before she caught herself and lowered it again. "I'm supposed to just take it? Let him get away with it so everyone else can feel comfortable?" Williams looked genuinely pained. "I'm not saying it's right. I'm just saying that's how things work around here. Thompson's got friends in high places, and he knows how to make life very difficult for anyone who crosses him." "What kind of friends?" Sarah pressed, sensing there was more to the story. Williams glanced around nervously before leaning closer. Colonel Bradley for one. They served together in Afghanistan. Thompson saved Bradley's life during an ambush, and Bradley's never forgotten it. Bradley's been protecting Thompson ever since, covering for him when complaints have come up before. This was new information to Sarah, and it painted an even bleaker picture of her situation. If Thompson had the protection of a colonel, then reporting the incident might not just be futile, it could backfire spectacularly. There have been other complaints, she asked. Johnson and Williams exchanged glances. Finally, Williams nodded reluctantly. A few female soldiers over the years. Nothing ever stuck. The complaints either got buried or the women who made them found themselves transferred out or discharged for other reasons. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. The picture being painted was of a systematic pattern of abuse and cover-up, with Thompson as the protected perpetrator and his victims silenced or removed from the equation entirely. So I have two choices, Sarah said quietly. Stay silent and let him continue to abuse me and others, or speak up and destroy my own career while he faces no consequences. I'm sorry, Williams said, and he genuinely sounded it. I know it's not fair. But that's the reality of the situation. As Williams walked away, Sarah noticed that other soldiers were watching their interaction with obvious concern. Word was spreading quickly about what had happened during training, and everyone was trying to position themselves safely away from any potential fallout. Sarah spent the rest of the afternoon alone, walking the perimeter of the base and trying to process her options. The rational part of her mind understood the warnings she had received. Military culture was built on loyalty, hierarchy, and protecting the unit above individual concerns. Going against that culture, especially as a newcomer and a woman, was career suicide. But another part of her refused to accept that reality. Her father had served with honor and distinction, fighting for principles of justice and equality. How could she dishonor his memory by staying silent in the face of clear wrongdoing? As evening approached, Sarah made her way back to the barracks. She had decided to document everything that had happened, writing down every detail while it was still fresh in her memory. Even if she couldn't act on it immediately, she wanted a record of the incident. What she didn't know was that her decision to take that solitary walk had been observed by someone with the authority to change everything. Colonel Patricia Hayes had been conducting her own quiet investigation of the base for the past 3 days. As part of the Pentagon review team, she had been specifically tasked with examining allegations of discrimination and misconduct within the Special Operations training pipeline. Hayes was a woman who had fought her own battles against military discrimination 20 years earlier, rising through the ranks despite constant obstacles and challenges. Hayes had noticed the young female soldier walking alone, her posture suggesting deep emotional distress. The visible bruise on the soldier's face immediately caught her attention, as did the way other personnel seemed to avoid making eye contact with her. Hayes made a mental note to investigate further, but her attention was soon diverted by an urgent message from her aide. The surveillance footage from that morning's training exercises had been reviewed, and there was something she needed to see immediately. In a secure conference room, Hayes sat with 3 other colonels from the review team as they watched the morning's training footage on a large screen. Colonel Robert Kim, Colonel James Sullivan, and Colonel Maria Rodriguez had all been selected for this assignment based on their impeccable records and their commitment to military justice. The footage showed the training exercise in clear detail. They watched as Thompson singled out Sarah, escalated the training beyond appropriate levels, and, finally, struck her across the face in front of the assembled soldiers. The audio captured not just the sound of the blow, but Thompson's derogatory comments and threats. The room was silent as the footage ended. These were seasoned military officers who had seen combat, dealt with difficult personnel issues, and made tough decisions under pressure. But what they had just witnessed was unambiguous assault and a clear violation of every standard of military conduct. How long ago was this recorded? Hayes asked her aide. This morning, ma'am. The incident occurred at approximately 0800 hours. Hayes looked at her fellow colonels. Recommendations? Colonel Kim spoke first. This is clear-cut assault and abuse of power. Thompson needs to be relieved of duty immediately and face court-martial proceedings. Colonel Sullivan nodded in agreement. The pattern of behavior suggested by his comments indicates this isn't an isolated incident. We need to investigate his entire service record and interview his previous trainees. Colonel Rodriguez leaned forward. What concerns me most is the reaction of the other soldiers. No one intervened, no one reported it. That suggests a culture of complicity that goes beyond just Thompson. Hayes had reached the same conclusion. We also need to consider the victim. Based on her service record, Private Martinez is an exemplary soldier with strong performance evaluations. She's exactly the kind of person the military needs to retain and promote. If we allow this incident to go unaddressed, we're essentially telling every female soldier that they're not truly welcome here. The colonels spent the next hour developing their response plan. Unlike the base's normal command structure, they had the authority to act swiftly and decisively. Thompson's connection to Colonel Bradley would not protect him from a Pentagon-level investigation, especially with video evidence of his misconduct. Hayes checked her watch. It was now early evening, and she made a decision that would change the trajectory of both Sarah's and Thompson's careers forever. I want Thompson detained tonight, she announced. We'll conduct the initial interview tomorrow morning, but I don't want him having the opportunity to intimidate witnesses or destroy evidence. Colonel Kim raised a practical concern. What about Martinez? She hasn't filed a complaint yet. Legally, we may need her testimony to proceed with charges. Hayes considered this. We have the video evidence, which is more than sufficient for the assault charge. But, you're right that her testimony would strengthen the case and potentially reveal additional incidents. We need to approach her carefully. Based on what I've observed, she's already being pressured to stay silent. I'll handle that personally, Hayes decided. As a woman who's been through similar experiences, I may be able to gain her trust more easily than any of you could. The plan was set into motion with military precision. While Sarah sat in her bunk writing her account of the day's events, unaware that help was coming, the wheels of military justice were already turning. Thompson, who had spent the evening drinking at the NCO club and bragging about putting that female recruit in her place, had no idea that his career was about to come to an abrupt and humiliating end. The irony was not lost on any of the colonels involved. Thompson's assault on Sarah had been witnessed by exactly the wrong people at exactly the wrong time. His luck, and his protection from above, had finally run out. As night fell over the base, Sarah finally finished writing her account of the incident. She folded the papers carefully and placed them in her personal lockbox, unsure if she would ever have the courage to use them. Outside her window, military police were quietly taking positions around Thompson's quarters, preparing for an arrest that would send shockwaves through the entire base. The next morning would bring revelations and consequences that neither Sarah nor Thompson could have imagined. For Sarah, it would be the beginning of validation and justice. For Thompson, it would be the end of everything he had spent 15 years building. The knock on Sarah's door came at 0630 hours, earlier than usual for morning wake-up call. She had barely slept, her mind replaying the previous day's events and struggling with the decision of whether to report what Thompson had done. The bruise on her face throbbed as she sat up, a painful reminder of the choice that lay before her. Private Martinez, a calm female voice called from outside her door. I'm Colonel Hayes. I'd like to speak with you privately, if you have a moment. Sarah's heart jumped into her throat. A colonel wanting to speak with her could only mean one thing. Somehow, word of yesterday's incident had reached the upper levels of command. She quickly pulled on her uniform and opened the door. Colonel Patricia Hayes stood in the hallway, her bearing commanding yet approachable. She was a woman in her 40s with graying hair pulled back in a regulation bun, and her uniform displayed an impressive array of ribbons and commendations. But it was her eyes that struck Sarah most. They were kind but sharp, the eyes of someone who had seen and overcome her own share of challenges. Private Martinez, I apologize for the early hour, but I thought it would be best if we spoke before the day's activities begin. May I come in? Sarah stepped aside, allowing the colonel to enter her small quarters. Hayes noticed the neatness of the room, the careful arrangement of personal items, and the stack of papers on the small desk that Sarah quickly moved to cover. "Please, sit down," Hayes said gently, taking a seat on the room's single chair while indicating that Sarah should sit on her bunk. "I know this is unusual, having a colonel show up at your door unannounced, but I want you to understand that this conversation is completely confidential unless you choose otherwise." Sarah remained standing, her training making it feel wrong to sit while a superior officer was present. "Ma'am, if this is about yesterday's training exercise, it is," Hayes interrupted softly. "And I want you to know from the outset that you are not in any trouble. You have done nothing wrong, and you are not being investigated or disciplined in any way." The relief that washed over Sarah was so powerful that she almost stumbled. For the past 18 hours, she had been wondering if she had somehow violated protocol by not immediately reporting the incident, or if her failure to stop Thompson's assault would be seen as a sign of weakness. Hayes gestured again for Sarah to sit, and this time she complied. The colonel's manner was so different from the aggressive, intimidating approach she had become accustomed to from her male superiors. There was strength in Hayes's bearing, but also compassion. "Private Martinez, I'm part of a Pentagon review team that has been investigating training practices and command culture at this facility. Yesterday morning's training exercise was recorded by base surveillance cameras, and I've seen the footage of what Sergeant Thompson did to you." Sarah's eyes widened in surprise. She hadn't known about the surveillance cameras, hadn't realized that the assault had been captured on video. Suddenly, her decision about whether to report the incident seemed less critical. The evidence already existed. "Before we go any further," Hayes continued, "I want you to understand something important. What happened to you yesterday was not training. It was assault, plain and simple. It was a violation of military law, military ethics, and basic human decency. No soldier, regardless of gender, rank, or experience level, should ever be subjected to that kind of treatment." The words were like a balm to Sarah's wounded spirit. For the past day, she had been second-guessing herself, wondering if she was overreacting or if this was simply the harsh reality of military training. Hearing a senior officer clearly state that Thompson's actions were wrong validated everything she had been feeling. "Ma'am," Sarah said quietly, "the other soldiers who were there, they warned me that reporting this could hurt my career. They said Sergeant Thompson has protection from Colonel Bradley." Hayes's expression hardened slightly. "Colonel Bradley is not part of this review team, and his relationship with Sergeant Thompson is actually part of what we're investigating. I want you to understand that you are now under the direct protection of a Pentagon investigation team. No one on this base, regardless of rank or connections, has the authority to retaliate against you for cooperating with our investigation." This was information that changed everything for Sarah. The power dynamics that had seemed so insurmountable the day before suddenly looked very different when viewed from the perspective of a Pentagon-level investigation. Hayes leaned forward slightly. "I need to ask you some questions about yesterday's incident, and I want you to feel completely free to tell me everything that happened. But first, I want you to know that Sergeant Thompson was arrested last night and is currently being held in the base detention facility pending court-martial proceedings." Sarah's mouth fell open in shock. Thompson arrested? It seemed impossible, given what everyone had told her about his connections and protection. The man who had seemed untouchable just 24 hours earlier was now behind bars. "The video evidence is sufficient for us to proceed with charges," Hayes explained, "but your testimony would strengthen our case considerably. More importantly, if Thompson has engaged in this kind of behavior before, your willingness to speak up might encourage other victims to come forward." Sarah thought about the conversation she'd had with Williams and Johnson, about their hints that there had been other complaints over the years. "Colonel Hayes, I was told yesterday that other female soldiers have complained about Sergeant Thompson before, but that nothing ever happened to him." Hayes nodded grimly. "We're aware of those allegations, and they're part of our broader investigation. The difference this time is that we have video evidence and the authority to act decisively. Thompson's previous protection is gone." Sarah took a deep breath and began to tell her story, starting with the way Thompson had singled her out during training exercises over the past weeks, his derogatory comments about female soldiers, and, finally, the assault itself. Hayes listened without interruption, occasionally taking notes, her expression growing more serious as the details emerged. "Has Thompson ever struck you or any other soldier before yesterday?" Hayes asked when Sarah finished her account. "Not that I witnessed directly," Sarah replied, "but there were times when soldiers would come back from individual training sessions with Thompson looking shaken. And I heard rumors, but I thought they were just rumors." Hayes made additional notes. "We'll be interviewing every soldier who has trained under Thompson in the past 2 years. If there are other incidents, we'll find them." The interview continued for another hour, with Hayes asking detailed questions about the base's culture, the reaction of other soldiers to the incident, and Sarah's own experiences with discrimination and harassment. Through it all, Hayes maintained a professional but compassionate demeanor that made Sarah feel heard and believed. As the interview concluded, Hayes addressed the practical concerns that Sarah had been wrestling with. "I know you're worried about your future here, and those concerns are legitimate. Military culture can be unforgiving to those who are seen as troublemakers. But I want you to know that this investigation has the backing of the highest levels of Pentagon leadership. Your cooperation will be viewed as an act of courage and integrity, not disloyalty." Hayes stood to leave, but paused at the door. "Private Martinez, you should know that your service record is exemplary. Your instructors have consistently rated you as one of the top performers in your training class. What happened yesterday had nothing to do with your abilities or your value as a soldier. It was about one man's prejudices and abuse of power." After Hayes left, Sarah sat alone in her room, processing everything that had just happened. The past 24 hours had been an emotional roller coaster, from the humiliation and despair of Thompson's assault to the sudden hope offered by the Pentagon investigation. Meanwhile, across the base, the news of Thompson's arrest was spreading like wildfire. Soldiers who had witnessed the assault were being called in for interviews, and the implications were sinking in for everyone involved. Private Johnson was the first to be interviewed, and he found himself face to face with Colonel Kim in a sterile conference room. Unlike his conversation with Sarah the previous day, Johnson now felt compelled to tell the complete truth about what he had witnessed. Sergeant Thompson's assault on Private Martinez was unprovoked and completely inappropriate, Johnson stated clearly, his earlier reluctance to get involved now replaced by relief that someone with authority was finally taking action. Corporal Williams, when his turn came, broke down during his interview with Colonel Sullivan. "I should have done something," he said, his voice thick with regret. "I have daughters at home, and if someone did to them what Thompson did to Martinez. But I was scared for my career, scared for my family's security." The pattern that emerged from the interviews was one of systematic intimidation and a culture of fear that had allowed Thompson's behavior to continue unchecked for years. Soldiers reported feeling trapped between their moral obligation to report misconduct and their practical need to protect their careers and families. But the most damaging testimony came from unexpected sources. Colonel Rodriguez's investigation into Thompson's service record had uncovered a former female sergeant named Lisa Chen who had been transferred off the base 2 years earlier after filing a complaint against Thompson. Chen, now serving at a base in California, had initially been reluctant to discuss her experiences. But when she learned about the video evidence and Sarah's assault, she agreed to provide a detailed statement about her own encounters with Thompson. "He made my life hell for 6 months, Chen told Rodriguez during a video conference call. The harassment was constant, comments about my body, suggestions that I was only there to provide entertainment for the male soldiers, deliberate sabotage of my training evaluations. When I finally reported it, I was told there wasn't enough evidence and that making false accusations could damage my career." Chen's account revealed that Thompson's pattern of abuse was not limited to physical assault but included psychological harassment, sexual comments, and systematic undermining of female soldiers' confidence and performance evaluations. As the day progressed, more former soldiers came forward with similar stories. The Pentagon review team found themselves documenting not just a single incident of assault, but a years-long pattern of abuse and discrimination that had been enabled by a command structure unwilling or unable to hold Thompson accountable. Colonel Bradley, Thompson's longtime protector, found himself summoned to an emergency meeting with the review team. The man who had once seemed so powerful and intimidating now looked small and defensive as he faced 4 colonels with the authority to end his career. "Colonel Bradley," Hayes began, her voice cold and professional, we need to discuss your relationship with Sergeant Thompson and your handling of previous complaints against him. Bradley shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Thompson is a decorated veteran who saved my life in Afghanistan. He's been an exemplary soldier throughout his career. Exemplary soldiers don't assault subordinates, Colonel Kim interjected. And they don't create hostile environments for female personnel. We have documented evidence of multiple incidents that were reported to your command and subsequently buried. The evidence was overwhelming, and Bradley's attempts to deflect and minimize Thompson's behavior only made his own culpability more apparent. By the end of the interview, it was clear that Bradley's career was also in jeopardy. As evening approached, Sarah found herself surrounded by a transformed environment. Soldiers who had avoided her the previous day now approached with words of support and apology. The atmosphere of fear and complicity that had protected Thompson was rapidly dissolving. But the most significant change was in Sarah herself. The young woman who had felt isolated and victimized just one day earlier now carried herself with a new sense of purpose and validation. She had spoken truth to power and discovered that, when the right people were listening, the truth still mattered in the military. The full consequences of Thompson's actions were yet to unfold, but Sarah now knew that justice was not only possible but inevitable. The system had worked, even if it had taken a Pentagon investigation to make it function properly. 3 days after Thompson's arrest, the entire base was buzzing with rumors and speculation. The news had spread beyond the immediate training unit to every corner of the installation, creating ripple effects that nobody had anticipated. Sarah found herself at the center of a storm of attention, some supportive and some hostile, as word of her role in bringing down a decorated sergeant became common knowledge. The morning formation was tense, with obvious gaps where Thompson and several soldiers who had been suspended pending investigation would normally stand. The new acting sergeant, Sergeant First Class Maria Gonzalez, was a no-nonsense professional who had been brought in specifically to clean up the unit's culture and training practices. I know there's been a lot of talk and speculation about recent events, Gonzalez addressed the assembled soldiers. Let me be clear about one thing: this unit will operate according to the highest standards of military conduct and professionalism. There will be zero tolerance for discrimination, harassment, or abuse of any kind. Her words were directed at everyone, but Sarah could feel the weight of certain soldiers' stares. Not everyone was happy about the changes that Thompson's arrest had brought about. Some of his supporters viewed Sarah as a troublemaker who had destroyed a good soldier's career over what they saw as normal military training. After formation, Sarah was approached by Sergeant Gonzalez. "Private Martinez, I'd like to speak with you privately." They walked to a quiet area behind the mess hall, where Gonzalez cowered.